today's program, 1 week after the 2020 election, we're speaking with two newcomers to the program, Kim Wehle and Jonathan Allen. Legal analyst Kim Wehle is a specialist in the separation of powers, administrative powers, and the federal courts. She serves as a legal analyst for CBS and contributes regularly to the BBC and PBS. Jonathan Allen is a senior political analyst for NBC News. He's covered elections, Congress, and the White House for the past 15 years and has served as White House bureau chief for Politico. I'm pleased to have them both here. Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
So, Kim, let's go to you first. It's like a moving target. Anytime we talk about anything, it's already old news. But there are some legal principles that have to hold, or we hope will hold. First of all, take us back 20 years to Florida 2020. Why is this not similar to 20 years ago?
Well, primarily because there is not a race that is the margins in which the margins are so narrow that a legal action could actually swing the entire election. I mean, Trump would have to get, John can talk about this more, but I think at least 3 states in his column to say that there was fraud and there was a basis for canceling out votes. And we just aren't, the closest thing we have is in Pennsylvania. There's a lawsuit pending in the United States Supreme Court prior to the election, complaining about counting ballots a few days after Election Day, so long as they were actually cast or prior to Election Day. But the last count I saw, it was only 7,000 or 8,000 ballots. 2000 was decided on 537 ballots in the state of Florida. And also that litigation was about a recount. And the Supreme Court basically decided on equal protection grounds not to allow the state to revise its recount procedures to make sure that the recount process was consistent across the state. We're not even in the universe of a lawsuit in this moment that I can see, having looked at them all, would justify even going to the Supreme Court, let alone swinging the election in favor of Donald Trump. This is more about politics, creating an impression in people's minds, which it seems to be doing. 7 out of 10 Republicans believe that there was fraud in the election, an impression that there was fraud by virtue of filing a lawsuit. The way the civil justice system works is you can file whatever you want. You can file a piece of garbage. There's no threshold test you have to meet to get actually a lawsuit filed. The test happens after you file it and it gets kicked out. And that's what's happening to these lawsuits. They're getting thrown out. But the public seems to think by virtue of just filing them, that must mean that there was something wrong that happened in the election in the state. And there just is no evidence of that.
Jonathan Allen, just to paint the immediate political picture, and this, what happened this afternoon to me was a microcosm, an amazing microcosm of where we are and the sort of bizarro world that this all is. That the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, said in a news conference there would be a smooth transition of power to a second Trump administration. And within a couple hours of that, the Turkish strongman Erdogan was congratulating Biden. And so here you have Pompeo with all of the Kansas charm saying that this ain't going to happen, folks. And Erdogan, who is hardly a modicum of admirable democratic practices, is congratulating Biden. What the hell is that?
Well, I think the leader of Turkey has decided, Erdogan has decided that Joe Biden's going to be the next president of the United States, and the faster he says that, the better off his country will be in its dealings with the United States. I think that's a pretty simple calculation on the part of a foreign leader. I'm not sure. My interpretation of Secretary Pompeo's remarks was largely that Secretary Pompeo is in a position where he feels like he has to endorse the legitimacy of the lawsuits going forward, and the possibility that somehow the election would be overturned. To get to Kim's point, the legal argument that is being made by the Trump administration, by the Trump folks right now, is essentially that you would have to discount ballots that have already been counted, right? So if you're talking about, on the one lawsuit that's legitimate that she was talking about before, is what do you do with ballots that came in after Election Day. Okay, the ballots that came in by Election Day show Joe Biden to be the winner of the Electoral College. Therefore, in order to overturn the results, and in the states that matter, the gaps in votes are so large that we've never seen a recount that overturned anything like that. So, really what you'd be talking about is denying the validity of votes that already have been counted. I cannot imagine any court doing that, much less the Supreme Court of the United States.
Right. And to John's point, there is no legal basis for that, right? Courts need to see a law that you claim has been violated, and then the court is going to look at facts and decide whether you can get the relief that's authorized under the law. I mean, complaining about not having enough people in the room to watch the canvassing process pursuant to some state regulation, that has nothing to do with counting actual votes. So there isn't any basis for a court to jump in, and courts are what we say, they're entities of limited jurisdiction. Their power is very narrowly circumscribed. They're only allowed to take cases where there's an actual live dispute under a law. And there's no law, as John says, no law in the land that allows anyone, any Supreme Court, to come in and start canceling ballots out. No such law exists. So this is a fool's errand, but one that has politically been powerful, because I speak to a lot of people lately, and even friends and neighbors, educated people, and people are really worried that this gambit could work. And that alone, in my mind, is a bit of a win for the Trump campaign, to create some impression that that the courts are going to hand the election to Trump, kind of like it happened with Bush. But that was, the stars aligned with Bush. But again, I keep getting texts. Is it true? Can this happen? Is the Supreme Court going to take the election away from Biden? And the fact that that's so worrisome, to me, shows that this really nefarious strategy is working, which is devastating, of course, for the legitimacy of the electoral process and the rule of law.
And real quick, one of the great oddities is, from a public relations standpoint and a political standpoint, is that Trump and his allies are going after places, Philadelphia, Detroit, where Joe Biden's raw vote total is lower right now than Hillary Clinton's. They basically decided that there's fraud in major cities because they like that narrative, but it's not actually where Donald Trump lost at least a couple of the big key states that turned. I've looked closely at the election data in Pennsylvania and Michigan in particular. In Pennsylvania, you saw huge vote total increases for the Democratic Party in Montgomery, Chester, and Delaware counties. If folks are not familiar with those, they are to the west and south of Philadelphia proper, and there's some diversity in those suburbs. But from a socioeconomic standpoint, they are wealthier suburbs. They are less African American than the city itself, and so Trump is kind of pushing this narrative that there's vote fraud in African American run cities. And ironically, even if he was to make that, he's making that argument at a time when the fraud, if it had happened, which it obviously did not, if it had happened, has done a very poor job by not even repeating the 2016 numbers that Democrats had. Meanwhile, next door in the suburbs that Trump said would be abolished, he lost both in terms of the increase in raw votes, but also the percentage. Chester County, Pennsylvania, for instance, 5.6 percentage points better for Joe Biden than Hillary Clinton. You go out to Wayne County, Michigan, which includes Detroit. Detroit's raw vote total for Biden is about 1,000 votes behind where Clinton's was. But Wayne County itself, which has a lot more voters, partially suburban, Wayne County itself had about a 9% increase in total votes. So the vote that Donald Trump lost was in the place where he fought the hardest, which was the suburbs, and now he's fighting to create this kind of false narrative of corrupt Democratic administrations in majority African American cities, which is, it doesn't make sense.
Well, the other really tricky thing about this fraud, this clever fraud, is that somehow it managed to only make one of the races on a single ballot fraudulent, right? So it's only the presidential race that somehow, it's all full of fraud, But everything else, if it was a vote for a Republican, if it was a split ballot where it was a Biden vote for president, but Republicans down the ballot, somehow it's only that part of the ballot that's fraudulent. Of course, it doesn't make any logical sense, which again is why these are going nowhere in court. But
and you say they're going nowhere in court, which is probably true, but I'm reminded of a conversation I had earlier in the election season with Suzanne Spalding, who's one of the leading counterterrorism experts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She spent a long time in the government, and she said just the idea that this was at the time when we were thinking, well, is Russia going to hack a voting machine in Wisconsin or something? She said just the idea, if it's put on social media by some troll farm in Russia, we've hacked into 50 voting machines in Wisconsin. And in fact, 0 were hacked. But the idea would be so damaging. And I'm reminded of that when here we are talking about these cases that are going nowhere. But the damage is being done. The idea that they exist, even though they may go nowhere and are going nowhere, is so damaging in itself. And I would think to myself before we got on this call about people who are like 8, 10, 12, 15 years old who are seeing this. Maybe it's their first election that they're sort of cognizantly aware of. And is this what they're going to grow up thinking is normal for the leading democracy in the world?
Well, I mean, John and I both have, kids in that range. And I'll tell you, from what I'm seeing, they see through this stuff clear as a bell. I mean, they understand.
But you're their mom, so they have.
But they, my 11-year-old walks around with the electoral map, and it's the points, and I mean, she literally was refreshing every 2 seconds. But there's this inherent, I think, sense of fairness and unfairness that we're all sort of born with, and that at some point we lose. So, but you raise a great point in that. How this is going to impact the generation, and this generation, in addition to being in the midst of a pandemic. I mean, so many things that we didn't have to live through. It will shape their worldview, and who knows? Maybe it'll go the other direction where they really desire. It's kind of like the kid of divorce that just will never have a divorce or something. That when they're grown up, that they'll really want integrity in government. I don't know. Maybe I'm just too optimistic.
That's a lovely thought. I hope you're right. Jonathan Allen, what do you think in terms of? You said you've been looking at a lot of numbers. We know 71 million people voted for Trump. A lot of people voted for Trump. I guess the Trump base is something like 38% of the American population. What do you think in terms of a month from now, 2 months from now? Are people going to soften up? I mean, there are going to be people in, way on the right with militias and all of this stuff, this QAnon or whatever. But what about just the average voter? Are they going to soften up, be brought towards the middle at all, or is it too late?
I mean, I think one of the things that's always been hardest to calculate is what percentage of the Republican Party is there completely for Trump and what percentage is there because they're Republicans and are, have supported Trump and grown close to him and bonded to him through the fires of the last 4 years. And so, I think we'll have to see. But Donald Trump has the strongest brand I've seen in American politics. And I think of it in those terms of a brand. Barack Obama too was somebody who had followers in the way that Trump does. That when anything Obama said, they sort of believed it in an almost like sort of religious fervor kind of way. And Trump has that too. But Trump's is really there's a set of Trump voters who are very into the denial of reality, or even more consequentially, very into sort of fever swamp conspiracy theory, QAnon stuff, like just sort of, and I think it stems from their belief in Trump as their champion. And they don't, this is not to criticize, who they believe in or why, but just to say some percentage of his voters are so strongly identify with him as a champion that they will literally be with him through anything, and they will find a justification to continue to be with him, even when there's decisions he makes, things he do that does that hurt them or against their ideology. We saw this with the China trade war. I went to Trump rallies in 2018 before the midterms and interviewed a lot of voters. And I remember this one soybean farmer in Minnesota, I think it was in Duluth, who told me that he was losing tens of thousands of dollars to from his farm to the trade war. And I said, well, are you still supportive of Trump? I mean, you're at a rally for him. You seem very supportive. And he said, I am. And I said, is there anything that would make you reconsider that? I mean, is there any amount of sacrifice that you have to be called on to continue to support him? And he said, if I lost my farm, I might start to reconsider. I was like, wow. Like, I mean, he could do you all the damage up to you actually losing not part of your livelihood, not most of it, but all of it. You know, probably a multi-generation farm. And so that stuck with me. I mean, the feeling of sacrificing for something larger than yourself and the amount of investment that you make in that, whatever it is, can, I think, make you susceptible to making excuses for people. And some percentage of the Trump electorate that is with him, and I think it is a smaller percentage, would, do kind of anything for him. And so we will see going forward, just to bring it back to the original point, we'll see going forward whether somebody else is able to kind of take over the core of the Republican Party, or if Trump remains in control of most of the Republican Party voters, even when he's out of office.
And to me, I'm a non-professional, but I'm a keen observer, and to me, it seems like why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't he just keep doing rallies and keep sending tweets? The only difference is it'll be from the Trump plane and not Air Force One, presumably, that he arrives to a rally at. But what's in it for him in doing anything different whatsoever?
Well, the stink of defeat. I mean, when you lose as a political candidate, the degree to which people are adherents to you goes away very quickly.
But if it's the stink of defeat, if it's defeat, and in 70% of the eyes as of right now, it's not defeat.
I think that will change. I mean, I could be wrong. It's maybe 2 years from now, 70% of Republican voters say that there was a fraud committed in an election where it's pretty clear the fraud wasn't committed. But my sense is that people are more likely to tell a pollster that they think that the election was stolen or that Trump got railroaded than actually believe that.
Kim Wehle, I'm looking behind you. I'm seeing that great title, "How to Read the Constitution and Why," and also the book about voting as well. But I'm looking at the Constitution. I'm thinking of that document that we're all told is living and breathing. That it's not just some stale thing. I mean, in my field in classical music, believe me, I do a lot with old things that are living. Beethoven is as fresh and alive today as he ever was. But we have to keep him alive.
Rolled over? Like roll over Beethoven?
He's been the victim of some cancel efforts, but I've been fighting back, and in your place, in the Bulwark, among other places, and I don't think they're getting anywhere fast. But we have to keep Beethoven alive by playing him, and we have to keep the Constitution alive by reading it and applying it and studying it and not seeing it as a museum piece. So what is it about the Constitution that you're looking to right now for guidance? What would you want to tell your 12-year-old?
Well, I mean, I wish that the premise of your question, frankly, was one that the members of the United States Supreme Court and the Legal Academy, the sort of scholarly academy, and I wrote these 2 books for regular people, but I've been writing scholarly works as a law professor for 15 years, something like that. And there's a debate about whether, like Beethoven, the Constitution is actually set in stone and is dead in 1788 when the original was ratified, and then with each amendment, and that you have to go back in your time machine and read it in a static way. That is essentially what Justice Amy Coney Barrett told Congress during her confirmation hearings, and a lot of Americans think that's real, and that's how good judges judge, and then only bad judges acknowledge that there's ambiguity in old ambiguous words. So unfortunately, living constitutionalism has become sort of sort of a buzzword for progressive judges who, quote, legislate from the bench. And, it's one of these things in constitutional theory that really is a scam. It's a scam that has been started really with Justice Scalia, who is a brilliant jurist, but and pushed by the Conservative Federalist Society to suggest that, well, only good judges apply the plain language, and bad judges, progressive judges, read into the Constitution like it's a living document. But of course, judges judge. That's what they're called. They're called judges. And when pressed, Amy Coney Barrett said, well, you have to look at the original public meaning. Okay. And so let's go back to the question of the election and whether all the ballots should have been counted by November 3rd. That's what the conservative Republican establishment, some of them are saying, that, following up on Trump's nonsense, saying that we should have counted all the ballots. Well, would an originalist say that in 1788, when it was, dirt roads and most people didn't leave their state, and if they did, it was on a horse or they walked? Do you think even with only a handful of states that all the ballots were collected and counted by 11:59 on election day? No. So originalism and this notion of, this frozen constitution is a way of justifying activism. It's a way of actually justifying tremendous activism around the Constitution. Like, for example, holding that corporations that didn't even exist when the Constitution was ratified, and even today, they're legal fictions designed to minimize liability. They're like fairies. Fairies are probably more real than a corporation. It's a fiction designed to manage money, that they have First Amendment rights like you and me, living, breathing people, and therefore they can spend unlimited amounts of money on the airwaves on issues relating to elections. That has completely distorted our electoral process, where you and I can only give $2,700 or so to a candidate, but if we had $50 million, we could spend it on air talking about the issues that actually get people elected that favor corporate America. So, gosh, to answer your question, of course, I get some flack on Twitter for having these books behind my head, but it's, as John can tell you don't get rich actually publishing books. I wrote these books so people could educate themselves on the basics. Only a third of Americans polled pretty consistently by the Annenberg Center and University of Pennsylvania can even name the three branches of government. Only a third: legislative, executive, and judicial. Only 6 states in the country require basic civic education as a condition to graduating from high school. Only 6. So it's not a surprise. If I go and the mechanic tells me that I need a new carburetor, I'm going to say, yeah, I need a new carburetor, because I don't know how an engine works. Likewise, when American voters hear this garbage and they don't have anything to test it against, and they're not empowered with their own information about how government really functions, they lack that agency. And so, I just think we need to start, in addition to many things, educating people. And my hope is, I agree with John. I think we're going to have President Biden, and I do think this drama and trauma, frankly, will be in the rearview mirror in most people's lives at some point, even though the historians and the psychologists, frankly, will deal with it for many years. I hope that this conversation around voting, around civic education, around what the Constitution means, not means to me, not the play, I have issues with the play, but actually how it actually works. I hope this conversation continues past January 20th. I think it's absolutely vital, because we're going to end up back here. And some predict with a worse would-be autocrat, somebody who's actually good at it. And if 4 years from now we have, Uber Trump, with a kind of populist voice that John indicates is so brilliant, which is true, not brilliant in a good way, but just once in a lifetime type ability to captivate people and make them make decisions against their own self-interests. And people are this uneducated about the basics, I think we're in trouble. So I think that's a foundation that needs to happen in the next 4 years. And I'm going to keep, beating my drum.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned civic education. We did a big panel on here with a couple of people, including Elizabeth Rinskoff Parker, who is the legal counsel for 15 years for the CIA. And she has a partnership with Ted McConnell and Suzanne Spalding. The three of them, I call them the Civic Musketeers, are going around preaching that civics have to be dealt with as a national security imperative. And it's at the point where the civic awareness is so bad in this country, so low and so bad, that it's damaging national security. And Jonathan Allen, I wonder if you could pick up and you're not Nostradamus, I get it, but if you could just try to make some prediction as to what's going to happen as these we're taking Kim's assumption here for fact that the cases are going to be thrown out slowly, one by one, and what's going to happen politically? Are people going to come around? And whatever happened, I know I'm saying a lot to you, whatever happened to the idea that, well, certain senators are fighting for re-election. Once they win re-election, then they'll be free to be themselves. That's totally gone out the window too, right? That's the past few days have proven that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. I don't think that. I do think that senators, when they are out of cycle, the first 2 years after they've won election, are a little more liberated than they normally would be otherwise. But the delta is small. The change from where they are during election cycle to outside of election cycle is small. I think what will drive the change in our politics is when there is a transfer of power, and we suddenly have new things to fight about, or old things to fight about with some of the new people involved in those fights. I think the one thing to keep in mind as you sort of look at what happens in a Biden presidency is that in order for him to get anything done, he needs a majority of the Republican conference in the Senate, not only to approve of what it is that he's trying to do, but to want to put pressure on Mitch McConnell to do it. So the kinds of things that Biden's going to be able to do are going to be things that necessarily have broad support within the Congress. It's going to be the lowest hanging fruit that he has to go after. And on the other side, the same thing is true in the House, where not only Nancy Pelosi will be able to bring things to the floor that Joe Biden wants her to bring to the floor, even if the majority of her caucus is not with it, but there is little malleability there. There's little flexibility there. She's not going to be able to pass things without most of the Democrats in the House voting for them. And so what you basically end up with is anything that Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi can agree on based on what the internal politics of their own caucuses are. That's not a recipe for getting a whole lot done in this environment. But I think Biden is someone who is probably coming in looking less to do ideological things than most presidents who come in a hurry. I'm going to be here. It may only be 4 years. I need to get in here. I need to get to do the ideological things that I promised on the campaign trail. We are so used to outsiders running for president and promising big change. With the exception of George H.W. Bush, no one has run as the insider candidate since the Lyndon Johnson-Nixon period, where the American public lost trust in the insiders. And now, for the first time in many years, they're like really turning to an insider. H.W. Bush, a little bit of an exception after 8 years of Reagan. So I think that will be something that's interesting to watch. Like, what can they get done? Probably something on COVID in terms of spending for COVID relief, and I think Biden will try to go for a big infrastructure bill, which will have the support of labor and will have the support of the Chamber of Commerce. But if Mitch McConnell wants to deny him a victory, a legislative victory, then it's pretty easy to do that. He just has to not bring a bill to the floor, which
he hasn't been doing often, and which he probably will, unless there's some magical friendship that can be renewed between the two of them. But you're talking about
friendships in politics are fleeting. Was it Lyndon Johnson who said, "If you want a friend, get a dog"?
So, Kim, jump in. You're about to say something.
Yeah, I mean, your question about sort of the structure of the Constitution, what's important to understand. A lot of focus has been on the presidency, and that's important because the belt and suspenders of the office have just been aggrandized to the point where there's just no tickets for speeding. I mean, it's like any job. If there aren't tickets if there aren't consequences for violating the rules of your job, you show up late every day, and eventually the company fails, and that's the situation. And who should be handing out tickets? It's the United States Congress. We've seen just just a stunning and shameful abdication of their constitutional prerogative of oversight of the presidency. And we're seeing it as we speak, given that, the major voices in the Senate and the Republican side are waffling about whether Joe Biden actually won the presidency, which I think goes to John's point. I don't think once he's actually seated, we're necessarily going to see them treat him any better. This is a really shameful way to treat a colleague of all those years. But a couple things for viewers and listeners who don't know necessarily a lot about the Constitution. I can't blame you because it's not taught to you. That's part of the problem. You can't know these things if no one explains it, and if it is explained, you're asked to memorize stuff. No one actually tells you how it works. But the Senate is inherently disproportionate. It doesn't actually represent a cross section of Americans, and that's because at the time of the framing of the Constitution, every state gets 2 senators. So the highly populated states like California have much less. Every voter has much less influence than a voter in, say, South Dakota. So a voter in South Dakota has much more power in the Senate, and the incumbencies last for a long time, not just by individual but by party. And so it's very hard to shift the Senate, and the Senate now is in Republican hands, and it's about just obstruction. And that this is one of the things that I just don't know necessarily how you get a lot around that, particularly in this moment. How does this obstruction happen? It happens not because it's in a law that Mitch McConnell gets to singularly veto legislation that passes in a bipartisan way the House of Representatives. Actually, the only person who could do that is the president. And the president does that only after it goes through both houses of Congress. It's not in a statute that Mitch McConnell could do that. It's not in the, it's not in a regulation. It's in the internal procedural mechanisms, rules of the Senate, but he just uses it in a way to basically stop all legislation that's he doesn't want to see come. Gun control legislation, COVID, a HEROES Act that was passed back in May would have helped individual families, also would have funded this election and bailed out the Postal Service and done all kinds of stuff. HR number 1, 2018 would have had same-day registration, automatic voters registration for teenagers, independent commissions to draw up legislative districts so we can get out of gerrymandering where politicians pick their own voters, not the other way around. None of this stuff is happening. That means our Congress is totally broken. And that's just, and we're just going to have to wait, frankly, until Mitch is no longer in that position. And hopefully whoever takes over is going to go back to respecting the office and serving the American public and not just a sheer power grab. I just think he is one of the most insidious, cancerous actors in American politics, and it has had a corrosive effect on the functioning of the separation of powers in the Constitution itself.
Jonathan Allen, can I ask you about polls?
I'm not sure I can follow that.
Oh, that's okay. I'll ask you a different question. You don't even have to follow that.
Good.
It was great. It was too much to follow, so we'll just go in another direction. We'll talk about polls. You've been looking at numbers. Alan Chartock over in Albany said there's some things you don't tell your mother and some things you don't tell your pollster. So, is what's going on with the polls? Was there way more of a shy Trump voter? What's happening here?
So a couple things. Number one, just to be clear, I followed what Kim was saying in terms of understanding it. I didn't want to have to follow that incredible cogent. See, having trouble doing it now. That incredible, cogent, and concise explanation of
it was an oration. It was a great oration, and I followed it too. By the way, it was extremely cogent and terrific.
But as far as the shy Trump voters go, I don't know a whole lot of Trump voters who are shy about it. I do think that there is a reluctance to participate with pollsters among a certain set within the Republican Party right now. I think that there is, some issues with some of the modeling. This isn't science; it's junk science, but it seems to have worked in 2 straight elections. I wrote a book called Shattered about the 2016 election, and one of the things that my co-author and I reported on was a Hillary Clinton advisor told her in, April or May of 2016 that every time you saw a Trump poll, you should add 3 or 4% to his side. and like that basically that there was just underpolling. It was something that this advisor had picked up from friends who were on, in Republican circles, that was going on. We definitely saw it in 2016, and we definitely saw it in 2020. The polls were, it's hard to say all the polls were off. I mean, polls are a snapshot. They do have margins of error. Oftentimes when we look at them and say, wow, that was wrong, they're actually within the margin of error. People don't understand margin of error very well. So, but in this case, I mean, I think Joe Biden ended the Real Clear Politics national poll average of 7, lead of 7.5. You go state by state, you'll see like him leading by 4 or 5 points in states where he ended up winning by like tens of thousands of votes, well within those boundaries. So I don't know that Trump voters are shy, but I do think that they like, trying to think of a word to use, screwing with the system.
You can use any word you want. There's no regulations on a podcast, but sure.
But my mom might watch it. So, to your point about lying to your mom or lying to your pollster, I'd like to keep my mouth clean. So okay. I don't hear about it from my mom.
Screwing a nice clean word. Kim, what do you are you just tearing your hair out as you look at case after case, and then it gets thrown out, it gets litigated? There's sort of the idea of some wild animal just throwing spaghetti at the refrigerator or whatever, much tomato sauce on the corners of the kitchen cabinets and all that. But I mean, there's damage being done. We talked about that, but it's going to continue. How long is this going to go on? How many cases are going to be ginned up?
Well, there are a couple important dates that are, not to use a Trumpian term, but around the corner. You use that with COVID. Well, the first would be December 8th. That is the date under federal law that state legislatures, if there isn't a clear victor in their state, can decide to meet and maybe, there are questions as to whether this statute is constitutional. It's very old. It's never actually been used. But the theory is, okay, if you can't count the ballots, say they're all it's in litigation, it's tied up, it's a hot mess. So we need to figure out who our electors are. And in all states but 2, it's a winner-take-all system. So there's a slate of Republican electors and there's a slate of Democratic electors, and it's all or nothing, which is one of the reasons people are upset about the Electoral College. It's narrow margins that trigger this disparity between the popular vote and the Electoral College vote, because that's because of this winner-take-all system. But imagine you've got state X, they can't figure out the vote, and so December 8th rolls around, and so the legislatures meet and they decide, okay, we're going to give all of our electors to Trump. That's conceivable, and that's floating around. It's been floating around within academics and experts on this. It's also floating around in kind of the conservative cyberspace. Trump supporters understand that that's an important date. There are issues with that that are super technical. In part, what if the governor doesn't sign the legislation into law? That's not actually a law then. And is it even constitutional to take the votes away from the electors? Can Congress give that authority? All this to votes away from the popular vote, the elector votes away from the popular vote, all of that stuff. But I think that so far we don't have any lawsuits that are throwing things in such disarray that we'd be at a point that would justify that kind of sort of nuclear option maneuver by a Republican legislature in a state, number one. Number two, then we need multiple states to pull that maneuver. And then they have to get away with it. The other important date is December 14th. That's the date that the electors by federal law are supposed to meet and cast their ballots. They're actually gavelled in to the Congress on January 6th, but the deadline for each state to send their electors to meet and cast the ballots that then go to Congress is December 14th. So we'll have to see if they meet and they cast the electors according to the popular vote on that day, which they're required to do under state law. Then, I don't think lawsuits are going to change anything. Now, back to Bush versus Gore, there's a question of recounts. But in most states, or many states, you need, like in Wisconsin, for example, you need a certain margin, narrow, tiny margin to justify a recount. And then we're not there. Well, actually, I think you could do it at a higher margin, but you have to pay for it. And Trump's running around trying to get money to fund these things when he's already in debt from his campaign. So we can keep seeing them, but those 2 dates are really important. If we get past December 15th and the electors meet and actually cast their ballots consistent with the popular vote of each state, then I think it's really hard to turn that ship around for Trump as a practical matter.
What's amazing to me is the concept that a recount from the same officials who were involved in the first count would result in something wildly different. It's just like, I mean, I keep trying to follow I keep hoping that there's some coherence, some logic to what the argument is that's being made. But, Trump wants a recount, but also wants to stop additional ballots from being cast. So, or being counted. And it's like, so you want to recount the ones where you lost?
Well, John, you are falling into the logic trap. That's not okay. I mean, but I think the delay is part of the problem, right? If we're all in recount land and then we get to December 8th, I think, but you're right. Statistically, recounts come up with maybe a handful of ballots, in double digits maybe, and they don't change elections almost.
What'd you say? How many votes?
I don't have the statistics at my fingertips. I read about it this morning, but if there are miscounted ballots, it's in the single or double digits generally. You're not talking 30,000 ballots that were miscounted. And as I said earlier, if that were the case, then you'd have to look at all the down ballot races too, and maybe we'd have the Senate flip or whatever. It's distraction, confusion, anxiety, stress, pressure on the system itself. I mean, Donald Trump has, and again, John can talk about this more eloquently than I can, but Donald Trump has run this campaign against American elections, period. It hasn't been a campaign against even Joe Biden. It's about destroying the legitimacy and integrity and American belief in the system. So the more chaos, it could be spaghetti, it could be something more serious than spaghetti, but the more chaos, that's a win. It doesn't actually have to legally produce logically a result. The logic part, he hung that up years ago.
And the constant undermining in the public's confidence in institutions that I think we all assumed, at least I assumed as a normal American citizen, assumed that we're sort of rock solid, that gets eroded. And as that gets eroded, you wonder how much the bar worldwide for democratic standards is being lowered. And you think of the effects on other countries as they look and they say, whoa, the U.S. has really lost it. Their democratic principles or their ability to make it work. Maybe we don't need to hold ourselves to such a high standard anymore, because look over there, look what they're doing.
I mean, most elections in foreign countries are much more straightforward than the one that we just witnessed, or that we are continuing to witness. That is not to say that there was fraud in our election. It's to say that the allegations of fraud are unusually ridiculous for countries in the world. I mean, of course, there are ballot issues. There are strongmen who have fake elections, whatever. But for a democratic election to result the way that this one did, and for there to be, this sort of like movement to call fraud and to try to like file what's the term, frivolous lawsuits to try to overturn it. Like we don't look like a shadow, like a pale shadow of America. We look like a pale shadow of a badly run authoritarian, dictatorship. It's just, I was watching President Trump's press conference early Wednesday morning and kept thinking like the arguments he's making are painful to the concept of democracy and the practice of republicanism. And I mean that with the small r, in that in order for us to be a beacon for other people and in order for our country to work, there has to be some belief that the system, even if it's not a purely democratic system, small d democratic system, generally reflects the will of the voters. And when you get to the point where you are not only using the rules that somewhat distort the will of voters or can somewhat distort the will of voters, but then you are on top of that trying to change those rules midstream, If that were to be successful, it would make a mockery of everything that I think most Americans stand for in terms of, and getting back to Kim's original point, the idea of fairness and fair play, but certainly what they believe in for democracy and how it informs our republic.
Yeah, I want to sort of make the Pollyanna-ish sort of goody two-shoes comment on that, though, this conversation, which is that we still managed to pull off an election in the midst of a pandemic with unprecedented attacks from established politicians with a lot of money on every stage of the process, attacking mail-in ballots, killing the HEROES Act, putting a crony in charge of the U.S. Postal Service and pulling back on delivery. And lying about the integrity of all kinds of stuff. On and on and on. And the pandemic hasn't abated, and we still did it. I think that and there's they can't, they're looking for the fraud. They can't find the fraud. I think I read it was 700,000 Americans participated on the front lines of democracy at the polls and in election officials making this work. These are not fraudsters. This is such an insulting accusation of all of these hardworking people, and some of them have come out publicly and said, "Don't say that about me. I care about my reputation. I don't miscount ballots and do awful things." But I think, I've been worrying about this for a few years now. This slip into authoritarianism. Back when I wrote the first book, and then talked a lot about Mueller on TV, and then it was impeachment. And I'm more sanguine in this moment now than I've been in a few years, frankly, about the future of American democracy, because the system worked. For now, the system worked, and we dodged not just a bullet, but a nuclear bomb. 4 more years of Trump, it was done. The American experiment was over. We would see renditions from the streets for people with political views that weren't consistent with Donald Trump. Why do we know that? Because he'll do whatever he can get away with, and he's gotten away with a whole lot of stuff. And if he got the mandate for 4 more years, there's literally no limits on what he would do to punish people. So it's really a beautiful moment for American democracy that this experiment continued to survive for now. And we'll just have to hold together and hope to put the pieces back one step at a time, because of course it's hobbled, it's broken, it's hollowed out in the executive branch. But I don't see a path for a coup, or whatever people are calling it. I just don't see a path. And maybe my brain doesn't work that way well enough to sort of think of the nefarious avenues. I don't see a way that Joe Biden is not sitting president January 20th, assuming that, nothing really horrible. He's healthy and ready to take office. I don't see. John, do you see a way?
I see Joe Biden becoming the president of the United States on January 20th, and Chief Justice John Roberts swearing him in front of a group that includes everyone that should be there except for perhaps President Trump, who seems to want to take his ball and go home while screaming at it. I'm not sure. The one thing I would sort of add, if I could, to what you were just saying is my optimism, to the extent that I have it, is despite the fact 37% of people, or whatever the number is, only a third of the people can name the 3 branches of government, according to that Annenberg School poll. I think almost 100% of Americans understand that they're not supposed to commit acts of violence at the polls. There was a lot of reasonable concern that things were going to get out of hand at the polls. And I know that there were outside groups that were agitating. I know that there were outside groups that were preparing, to combat violence at the polls. And thank God it didn't happen, because that's what happens in countries that are not working, that are broken and dysfunctional. But in the end, almost 100% of Americans believe that whatever it is we have is worth preserving, is not worth tearing down with, with acts of violence. They believe that that politics is the means of change in the direction that they want, and that they need to just turn out more voters, not turn out more violent acts.
You
Totally agree.
You both went the optimistic route. I usually ask people at the end when things are looking doom and gloom, what are you optimistic about? But you offered it without my even asking. So that was very nice. And I have to say, I was thinking as I walked to the polls on election day. I'm usually traveling, so I usually vote absentee, but this year I'm not. So I walked in a small town in New Hampshire, and it felt great. It was great weather. I came home and sat down, glued myself to the TV, and I kept watching reports of peaceful, smooth voting operations all over the country. And I had people on here from big think tanks in D.C. saying there's going to be major violence on election day. And I was every hour thinking, wow, this is really looking smooth and peaceful. And it was beautiful weather all over the country. And I think it was a very exciting and a very heartening day for a lot of the reasons you mentioned.
Well, it's also, we didn't see the huge lines we saw during some of the primaries that went for hours and hours. I mean, we didn't see people passing out from exhaustion or dehydration. We didn't see what we saw in Kentucky with, people banging on the doors to be allowed to vote because the polling place was closed and not allowing people that were in line and on time to get in there. We didn't see tons of broken machines. We didn't see huge disparities, and I don't know all the data, but it certainly wasn't reported that, we saw low income or minority communities really get, as has happened in the past, the short end of the stick in terms of the resources. And this was all during a pandemic, where most states had to do 2 elections during a pandemic with not enough money because Congress wouldn't give it. 5 states have almost exclusively voted by mail, but everybody else gets a handful of mail-in ballots. So those had to be opened, unfolded, stacked, put through machines, verified. It's really amazing what regular Americans pulled off. And it's different in every state. If we had, as John said, like other democracies, if we had one way of doing things, April 15th, you file your taxes. But we did it even with all these disparate laws. It's really, to me, I think about it, it's just incredible. Because I used to say a month ago, gosh, all these things have to go just right to not have a major catastrophe somewhere. And it did not happen. It's just awesome.
Jonathan Allen, what political story or two should we be looking at that maybe isn't on the front page? Where should we look that that you are someone like you with your finger on the pulse?
I think the big story to me is, what are these 2 parties going to do to try to figure out a way to be fighting over something different than the last 0.5% of the electorate? We've really gotten to this polarized, divisive, and evenly polarized and divided electorate. And so what you see is, literally more than $1 billion, $2 billion, I don't know what the final count is, spent on moving a couple of swing states a percentage point or 2. And so, for the rest of us in the country, we participate in the political process. I went to vote, same day voting. I love the fact that there was no line. But I think, obviously I prefer that we didn't have COVID. Let me be clear about that. But from a voting perspective, it was nice to not have to take long to go through there. I think what I would be watching for is, who are these parties going to be in the future? The Republican Party under Trump is vastly different than the Republican Party was before Trump in terms of a coherent policy agenda. There is no consistent Trump value other than the acquisition and maintenance of power. There are leanings that he has. He leans protectionist, or if you prefer, leans. I don't even know what the euphemism for that would be, but he has leans, but he doesn't have a real code of who he is. And by the same token, Joe Biden was just elected by the entirety of the Democratic Party and a handful of Republicans, many of whom don't agree with each other on anything other than Donald Trump had to go. And most people couldn't tell you what Joe Biden's agenda was. The vast majority of people who voted for him couldn't tell you. I know political reporters who do this for a living who couldn't tell you, who would probably say something like, well, Build Back Better. his slogan basically, and a slogan, by the way, that was not like, particularly inspired. It's alliterative, I'll give it that. But I mean, the point was to not be inspiring in some ways. They didn't want people to pay attention to what their agenda was. So from a policy perspective, like, who are these parties going to be going forward? From a values perspective, who are these parties going to be going forward? Because this fight this year that was 50-50 was about the character and personal qualities of the two presidential candidates in contrast to each other. And while that is something that frequently happens in politics, I think at a time when we are so evenly divided, there is like a real danger of just like having red and blue that mean nothing other than the colors of the jerseys. And that can't be good for, I don't think that's likely good for anyone. So I want to see what these parties do to actually have agendas going forward. What is it that they're going to do for everybody else who's not part of the $2 billion political industrial complex? And it's actually much more than $2 billion.
Yeah, well,
yeah.
I agree, and I think that will inevitably happen, in that we've just had trauma and chaos for 4 years. There just hasn't been space to have those conversations, and in the process where we've gotten to the point, and I find, even as an academic now, I've been on some panels at, in law school environments, where I find myself on the panel having to defend facts versus talk about legal theories and policy when it's around something that touches Donald Trump. So we're in this sort of gaslighting state where we have to defend that, the sun comes up in the morning where we live and the grass looks green. And no, it's not green. And then that's crazy making. And we're also having a debate, and this election was about the debate as to whether human life matters, whether 240,000 approximately dead Americans climbing, and there's misinformation about that. I don't know how many people understand really the link between wearing masks and enhancing the economy. But some pollsters that I've heard think that a lot of the support for Donald Trump, a surprising support for Donald Trump, was this idea: listen, I don't want Joe Biden to close the country. I need the economy up, and so people die. And maybe that is something we can debate in terms of, okay, here are the things on the table. It's a cost-benefit analysis. That's how law is done. That's how good policy is made. But we, people who, at least I can speak for myself, do public speaking sometimes, having to articulate the fact that we as Americans really should care about minimizing mass suffering and death. That is something that we've had to put on the table. Is just, I think when it's over, it's going to seem like it almost really that happened. Did we live through that? So I think John's right. I also wonder how much, frankly, the Republican Party is going to survive. One thing that I've seen in this process is kind of moderates from old school Republican Party and old school Democrats kind of come together, or people call it never Trumpers or whatever, the Lincoln Project, but that people that are galvanizing around tradition, the rule of law, basic decency as people. And, who knows? Like, again, I'm going to be optimistic. I would love to see that become the new political party, the party of common sense and compassion. That would be nice.
I do hear it a lot from people. I really do have friends on the left and the right, and I'm not one of those people that goes around ditching all my friends because they said they like someone or didn't. But I really do hear from people all over the place that they're desperately being forced towards the center, and they feel okay with it. They just want to sort of be able to yell and scream, but then sort of go hang the Christmas lights together after it's all said and done, like Heidi Heitkamp put it. I mean, and that seems foreign now, but maybe that's something to aspire. It is something to aspire to, not maybe. And who knows? Optimism reigns supreme, at least on the end of this conversation with Kim Wehle and Jonathan Allen. I can't thank you both enough. It was great. Hope we can do it again.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.